He went out for bread and never came back. It took 15 years until the family learned the terrible truth. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what city you're from. I wonder who is with us. The morning had the stillness of a held breath. Soft light spilled through the windows of the Carter household, casting muted streaks across worn floorboards and faded wallpaper. The kitchen clock ticked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, and the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence left by words unspoken. It was one of those deceptively peaceful mornings, the kind that felt ordinary only in hindsight, the kind that would fracture a family, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a door closing behind a man who said he would be right back. Linda Carter sat at the head of the breakfast table, her wheelchair angled slightly to the side so she could face her children. Her legs, long immobilized by the accident, were neatly covered by a woolen blanket, though spring had already begun to warm the air. Her hands, once graceful and expressive, trembled faintly as she sipped from a mug Jacob had prepared for her. The smell of instant coffee and toast lingered in the air, but no one seemed to be eating. Henry stood by the coat rack, shrugging into his worn brown jacket. His eyes met Linda's briefly, and something unsaid passed between them, something old and weary, threaded with guilt and fatigue. Jacob, perched on the edge of a dining chair, watched his father with silent suspicion. At 17, he bore the demeanor of someone far older, shoulders hunched with the weight of responsibility too great for his years. Mornings like these were always the same. The dull routine, the unspoken tension, the forced normalcy of a family held together by habit and necessity. Henry offered a brief smile. "I'm going to grab bread and a few things for dinner," he said, fishing his wallet from the kitchen counter. "Be back in a bit." "Don't forget the milk," Mia reminded him, her voice thin but trying to sound cheerful. She was 14, still on the edge between childhood and adolescence, her bright eyes dulled in recent months by the mounting pressure of their situation. She tried to smile, but her gaze flitted between her parents, her unease barely concealed. "I won't," Henry replied, reaching down to tousle little Oliver's hair. The toddler, seated on the floor with a plastic train, giggled and looked up at his father with absolute trust. Linda's voice was soft but firm. "Take your time, Henry. Just come back safe." Henry paused, eyes locking with hers for a heartbeat longer than usual. Then he nodded, opened the door, and stepped into the crisp morning air. The door clicked shut behind him. The moment stretched. Jacob glanced at the clock. He could have waited another 5 minutes. The bakery doesn't even open until 9. "He's been restless lately," Linda murmured, trying to keep her tone neutral. "Probably wanted some air." "Restless or tired of us," Jacob muttered, pushing back his chair and standing abruptly. "I'll walk Mia to school." Linda didn't answer. She turned her face toward the window instead, watching the sidewalk where Henry had just disappeared. Her heart tugged strangely, a subtle clench of unease she couldn't quite place. The day unfolded with monotonous slowness. Mia returned from school around 3, and Jacob came home shortly after from his part-time shift at the garage. Oliver napped on a blanket in the living room, and Linda tried to ignore the rising worry clawing at her chest. Henry still hadn't come back. By dusk, she could no longer keep silent. She asked Jacob to call the bakery. No one had seen him. Then the supermarket, the gas station. Linda's voice grew thinner with each call, her composure unraveling strand by strand. By nightfall, they contacted the police. 2 officers came to the house, their expressions too calm to comfort. They took notes, asked questions, nodded. No, there was no indication of foul play. Yes, adults were free to disappear. Maybe he just needed space, one officer offered. It happens. Jacob's hands clenched into fists. My father doesn't just walk out. He wouldn't do that. But the officer's expression didn't change. The next morning, Henry's car was found abandoned at the edge of a dirt road several miles from town. The keys were still in the ignition, doors locked, nothing missing, no signs of struggle, no notes, no clues, just an empty vehicle in the middle of nowhere. And so, the whispering began. People said things. At the grocery store, in the school hallways, outside church. Poor woman. He ran off, didn't he? She's in that wheelchair. I bet it was too much for him. A man can only take so much. The first few days passed in a blur. Linda refused to cry in front of the children, even as her eyes grew red and hollow. Mia clung to her schoolwork and stopped writing poetry. Oliver began asking when Daddy was coming back, his voice hopeful at first, then confused. Jacob stopped talking altogether. The police gave up within 2 weeks. No leads, they said. We'll keep the file open, but there's not much we can do. Bills piled up. Without Henry's income, they couldn't keep the mortgage. Within 3 months, they moved from their modest but comfortable house to a small rented duplex in a rundown part of town. The garden Henry had planted with his own hands grew wild and untended. Jacob took a second job. Mia dropped out of her after-school programs. Oliver started to forget the sound of his father's voice. But worse than the financial hardship was the silence. A long, heavy quiet that hung over the family like fog. No answers, no closure, just an absence that pressed itself into the walls of every room. At night, Linda sat awake in her wheelchair, staring out the window. Sometimes she imagined she heard footsteps in the driveway. Other times she thought she saw a figure in the shadows. But no one ever came. Jacob grew up fast. Too fast. He didn't go to college, though he had the grades. He stayed home instead, worked at the local garage full-time, and paid bills with the stoic resolve of someone who didn't believe in anything anymore. He never spoke of his father. Mia moved out as soon as she could. She won a scholarship, studied psychology, and visited only when necessary. Her conversations with Jacob were cordial but strained. She believed in forgiveness. He did not. Oliver grew into a gentle but detached teenager. He asked questions sometimes, but learned not to expect answers. Years passed, 15 of them. The family adapted in the way that wounded animals adapt, by limping, by avoiding pain, by becoming something less than they were. But the wound never fully healed. The shadow of Henry's absence lingered, shaping who they became and how they loved. Then, one afternoon in late spring, the phone rang. Jacob answered it in the kitchen, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. The voice on the other end belonged to a detective from the city. He spoke carefully, with the kind of practiced gentleness that only came with delivering bad news. They had found a body. Jacob listened, unmoving, as the detective explained. The remains were discovered during the demolition of an old meat processing plant in the industrial district. A body, concealed in a sealed refrigeration unit. Male, middle-aged, a wallet, some personal effects, DNA already matched, Henry Carter. But here was the part that made Jacob's blood turn to ice. The forensic team estimated the time of death to be within the last 2 months. 15 years missing. And he had only died recently. Jacob hung up without speaking. He stood in the kitchen, the old clock ticking behind him, and stared at nothing. Outside, birds chirped in the trees, and a car drove by, bass thumping faintly from its speakers. The world continued indifferent. Then he picked up his keys and drove home. Linda didn't cry. She listened, her face pale, her hands trembling in her lap. She looked toward the window as if expecting to see him standing there. For a long time, no one spoke. Then she whispered, "I told you. He didn't leave us." Mia arrived the next day. She was stunned, uncertain. She held her mother's hand, asked Jacob to explain everything again. He did, with clipped words and hollow eyes. Oliver sat on the porch steps, staring into the street. When Jacob came out, the boy asked softly, "So, he didn't run?" "No," Jacob said, "he didn't." They all felt it, the shift, the weight of a decade and a half of resentment, confusion, pain, suddenly heavier now that it was rooted in injustice, not betrayal. Henry had been alive, somewhere. Doing what? And why hadn't he come back? The questions circled like vultures, and none of them had answers. But one thing Jacob knew for certain. The man he had spent 15 years hating had not abandoned them, and someone had made sure he would never return. The days that followed were a haze of phone calls, questions, and hollow apologies from a system that had long since moved on. The local news picked up the story within 24 hours, broadcasting the headline with a somber gravity that couldn't conceal the sensational undertone. "Missing man found dead after 15 years. Murder suspected." It was all over the town by morning. Faces that hadn't spoken to the Carters in years suddenly found reason to call, to stop by, to offer condolences seasoned with disbelief. Jacob ignored them all. He stood in the police station lobby, the sterile air reeking faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. The detective from the city, a man named Harlan Graves, met him with a handshake that was firm but not warm. Graves was in his early 50s, his eyes ringed with the fatigue of too many years spent chasing answers that came too late. He led Jacob into a private conference room and closed the door behind them. "I want to thank you for coming," Graves began, unfolding a thin file on the table between them. "I understand this isn't easy." Jacob said nothing. He folded his arms and stared at the man. "We confirmed the identity through DNA cross-checks. Henry Carter. The remains were remarkably well preserved considering the environment." "Environment?" Jacob's voice was flat. "The body was hidden inside an industrial refrigeration unit, sealed off in a disused wing of the Westline meat processing facility. The plant closed down about 8 years ago, but some of the older sections haven't been accessed in much longer. They only started demolition last week. That's when they found him." Jacob's fingers tightened around his biceps. "We estimate the time of death to be somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks ago," Graves continued. "That's based on autopsy findings. The internal organs were largely intact. Cause of death appears to be blunt force trauma to the head. Single impact, instantaneous." Jacob blinked slowly, the words registering like distant thunder. "He was alive," he said at last. "All those years. He was alive." Graves nodded grimly. "That's what we're working to understand. There's no record of him under his legal name after he disappeared, but we did find something." From the folder, the detective produced a small plastic evidence bag. Inside it was a worn leather wallet and a set of keys. The wallet, once brown, had darkened with age and moisture, but the initials HC were still faintly visible. Graves handed it to Jacob. He had some cash, nothing traceable, no credit cards, but we found a key among his belongings, one that led us to a storage locker in the transit depot downtown. Jacob looked up sharply. It was registered under the name Andrew King. We believe that was your father's alias. Inside, we found several personal items, clothing, notebooks, and a stack of letters, all sealed, all addressed to your family. Jacob's throat tightened. "Letters?" Graves nodded and pulled out another evidence bag, this one larger. Inside was a bundle of envelopes, yellowed with time, each one marked with a different date in the top right corner. Jacob's name was written in the familiar, looping cursive of his father's hand. So was Mia's. So was Oliver's. And Linda's. He wrote one each year, the detective said quietly. It appears he never mailed them, though they were clearly meant to be. We're currently going through the contents to see what we can release to you, but I skimmed a few. They're personal. Regret mostly. Fear. Hope. It seems your father wanted to return. Something stopped him. Jacob stared at the letters through the plastic, the breath caught in his lungs. We believe he was living under the alias Andrew King in a rural property just outside Clarendon. Small town, no more than 100 people. He rented a trailer from a man named Dale Bruner. Paid cash, never drew attention to himself. Bruner told us he'd been there for about 12 years. Did Bruner know who he really was? Jacob asked, barely above a whisper. No, Graves said. He said your father kept to himself. Quiet man. Kind. Said he talked about having a family once, but never went into detail. Jacob rubbed his temples. So he just disappeared. Changed his name. Lived alone for 15 years. Graves hesitated. He wasn't entirely alone. Jacob looked up sharply. We found evidence of communication with another individual, limited but suggestive. Notes, receipts, and what appear to be coded entries in his notebook. There are repeated references to someone named PR and phrases like meet debt and K incident. We're working to decipher what these mean, but PR, Jacob interrupted, the letters sparking something in his mind. That could be Paul Remington. He was a city councilman when my dad disappeared. Owned that same meat processing plant, if I'm not mistaken. Graves's brow furrowed. We're looking into that. Don't look, Jacob said, standing. Dig. He left the station with the letters clutched tightly in his hand. The sunlight outside was too bright, the breeze too gentle, the world too oblivious. He drove back to the house without turning on the radio, without speaking a word. When he walked through the front door, Mia was already there, sitting with Linda in the living room. Oliver hovered by the window, his arms folded across his chest. Jacob laid the letters on the coffee table. They all stared. Mia reached out slowly, her hand trembling as she picked one up. She turned it over, then opened it carefully, as if afraid it might shatter. As she read, tears welled in her eyes. He never stopped thinking about us, she whispered. Oliver picked up his own letter, marked with his name. He read it silently, mouth set in a tight line, then sat down heavily in the armchair. Linda didn't move. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, eyes on the envelope with her name written in the script she hadn't seen in 15 years. She said nothing as Jacob placed it in her lap. She just stared at it, her lips pressed together so tightly they were almost white. Why didn't he come back? Oliver asked suddenly. If he was alive, if he loved us, why didn't he? Because someone didn't let him, Jacob said. They all looked at him. He saw something, he went on. That meat plant, he wrote about it. He saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Someone made him disappear. Mia blinked. Disappear? Like forced him to run? Or made it seem like running was the only way to keep us safe, Jacob said. Think about it. Why change his name? Why live under an alias in the middle of nowhere? Why write letters and never send them? He was scared. Scared enough to stay away. Until he wasn't, Mia murmured, her gaze distant. Until he tried to come forward. Jacob nodded slowly. And then they killed him. The silence that followed was deep and sharp. Linda spoke at last. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Find them," she said. "Find who did this to him." Jacob looked at her, his jaw tightening. "I will." The next morning, he drove to Clarendon. The trailer was still there, cordoned off by police tape, the door sealed. The neighbor, Bruner, stood by his pickup truck, watching him with cautious curiosity. "You knew him as Andrew King?" Jacob asked. Bruner nodded. "Yeah, quiet guy, kept to himself, always paid on time, never caused trouble." "Did he ever talk about his past?" Bruner scratched his head. "Not much. Said he had a family once, said he lost them." Jacob swallowed. "Did he seem scared?" Bruner shrugged. "Not scared exactly. More like waiting. Like he was always listening for something. Never used a phone. Never had visitors, except once in a while this man would come by. Middle-aged, well-dressed, drove a black car. They'd talk outside. I figured it was family or something." "Did you get a name?" "No, but he called him Ronald." Jacob froze. He drove back to the city and pulled up every record he could find. Paul Remington was now the mayor, with a clean public record, a charitable foundation, and a reputation for urban revitalization. But, buried in a news archive, Jacob found a single article from 17 years ago. "Worker dies in meat plant incident. Investigation closed." The name of the deceased was blurred behind corporate language, but the timing was too precise. The article mentioned Paul Remington, and it also mentioned an employee named Ronald Mathers, head of security at the plant. The same name, the same man. Jacob stared at the screen, his blood pounding in his ears. He printed the article, took the letters, and returned home. Mia was waiting for him. "I think Dad was trying to blow the whistle," he told her. "I think he was going to testify, and someone killed him before he could." Mia looked down at the letter in her hands. "Then we need to finish what he started." Jacob nodded. "We will." Outside, the wind shifted, the garden was quiet, and for the first time in 15 years, the Carters weren't just waiting anymore. They were moving. The days that followed were marked not by mourning, but by movement. Grief had no place in Jacob's chest, not yet. Not when so many questions still loomed unanswered. Not when his father's blood cried out for justice louder than sorrow ever could. The moment the last letter had been read, the moment he looked into his mother's face and saw the command there, firm, unwavering, and quietly desperate, he had known there would be no rest. Not for any of them. Not until they knew who had silenced Henry Carter. Jacob began with the storage locker again. Though the police had already combed through it, he returned with fresh eyes and a different purpose. He walked through the tight corridor between rows of rusting metal doors until he reached the locker marked with a strip of masking tape that still bore the fading words, Andrew K. He crouched in the dim concrete box, surrounded by the scent of old paper and damp cloth, and began going through everything again. The letters had already been catalogued and photocopied, but he found a small notebook wedged into the sleeve of a worn denim jacket the police had apparently overlooked. Its leather cover was cracked, the pages inside smudged, filled with shorthand entries and phrases that made little sense in isolation. But Jacob recognized the careful, deliberate hand. His father had written it like a man who feared someone else might read it. Page after page was littered with abbreviations and references, phrases like K incident cover-up, PR and RM meeting, 14th Street storage. There were coordinates, addresses, and what appeared to be vehicle license plates. Jacob photographed every page and sent copies to Mia, who had taken over compiling a digital archive of everything they had learned. She worked from her small apartment in the city, her job on hold now that the case had consumed them all. Oliver, though still in school, was now as deeply involved as they were. Quiet and watchful, he monitored online forums, tracked old news articles, and watched video after video of council meetings, interviews, and town records, building a timeline of Remington's rise to power. The mayor's pristine public image had no cracks, but to those who knew where to look, the timing of his wealth and influence lined up suspiciously well with the disappearance of a man who had seen something at a slaughterhouse. One evening, while Jacob and Oliver pored over the notebook together, a name reappeared for the third time. Ronald. No last name, no details, just the name. Always written in parentheses or brackets, always alongside entries like threats, watching, or messenger. Mia dug deeper and found an old employee roster from the Westline meat plant, which had long since gone bankrupt. There, on a barely legible PDF scan, was a name. Ronald Mathers, Director of Security. Jacob's chest tightened. The man who visited Dad at the trailer, he said aloud. It has to be him. The next day, Jacob and Mia met in person at a diner halfway between their homes. Over greasy coffee and untouched plates of eggs, Jacob laid out everything they had gathered. When he mentioned the name, Mia's brow furrowed. I ran a background check. He's off-grid now, no listed address, no employment records in over a decade. But there's a private security firm that's still registered under his name in state databases, Shield One Consulting. It's a shell company, but it pays out salaries to a few names every year. One of the payments went to a property management service that maintains a set of storage units in the industrial sector. Where Dad was found, Jacob said quietly. Mia nodded. Exactly. The pieces were aligning, but they still lacked proof. Jacob reached out to a private investigator his father had once worked with, a grizzled man named Russ Marlowe, now retired. Russ was in his 70s, wore the same leather coat year-round, and smoked even when it made him cough until he turned red. But he remembered Henry Carter. He remembered the kindness, the integrity. I knew something was wrong when he vanished, Russ said when they met in a park near the river. He came to me a few days before he disappeared, said he'd seen something bad, said people might get hurt. He asked me about whistleblower protections, about witness protection. I gave him what advice I could, but I think he'd already made up his mind to go underground. Jacob leaned forward. Do you remember who he was worried about? Russ nodded slowly. He didn't name them directly, but he said they run this town. Said he saw a man die, that it wasn't an accident, and that someone with a badge helped cover it up. A man die? Jacob's voice was tight. Are you sure he said that? Russ tapped the side of his head. I remember the exact words. I watched him die, and I wasn't supposed to. That's what he said. I asked if he'd go to the cops. He said, they are the cops. After that, I never saw him again. Jacob left the meeting with his heart thudding in his ears. The story wasn't just about Remington anymore. It was bigger. It was deeper. If a murder had occurred inside the plant and Henry had seen it, then the silence wasn't just about threats. It was enforced by the weight of authority, by men who held power and had no fear of consequence. The next clue came from an unlikely source. Oliver, browsing through an old web archive, found a cached page from a now-defunct whistleblower site. It contained an anonymous post dated 3 years after Henry disappeared. The writer described working security for a meat facility and witnessing an incident where a man was accidentally killed during a fight with a superior. The writer claimed the death was covered up, the scene cleaned, the footage wiped. The post mentioned two initials, PR and RM. Jacob stared at the screen, chills creeping down his spine. The post ended with a sentence that hit him like a fist to the chest. I never saw him again, but I heard later he disappeared. I don't know if it was a payoff or something worse. All I know is the man didn't deserve it. "This is the moment," Jacob whispered. "This is when they buried it." They had motive, opportunity, names, and now a trail of witnesses that stretched back 15 years. But it wasn't enough. Not without hard evidence. Not with men like Remington still walking free, still shaking hands with governors and signing ribbon cuttings for community centers. Then came the attack. Jacob came home from the shop late one evening to find the front window of their family's house shattered. Inside, the living room was ransacked, drawers overturned. The letter copies Mia had printed and pinned to the wall were gone. His mother, thankfully, had been staying with Mia for a few days due to renovations, but the message was clear. They were being watched. The police arrived and took a report, but Jacob could see it in their eyes, the unease, the hesitation. They were dealing with something larger than a break-in, and some of them likely knew it. "This is bigger than we thought," Jacob said the next morning as he, Mia, and Oliver regrouped in her apartment. "They know we're getting close. That means we are." Mia was pale, but her voice didn't shake. "So, what now?" Jacob took a deep breath. "We find Ronald Mathers. We get him to talk." Oliver hesitated. "If he's dangerous—" "He's the key," Jacob interrupted. "He knows what happened. He's the only one left." Mia nodded slowly. "Then let's finish this." That night, Jacob returned to the coordinates listed in the back of Henry's notebook. It was a storage lot on the edge of the industrial district, remote, surrounded by half-abandoned warehouses and rows of flickering street lamps. One unit was listed under Shield 1. The address matched the payment records Mia had uncovered. Jacob didn't approach the unit directly. Instead, he parked across the street and waited. Hours passed. Then, near midnight, a black SUV rolled in. A tall man stepped out, middle-aged, stocky, wearing a leather jacket. Jacob recognized him immediately from Bruner's description. Ronald Mathers. He watched the man unlock the unit, step inside briefly, then return to the SUV. Jacob followed him at a distance, keeping his lights off. Mathers drove north into the hills. Eventually, he pulled into a narrow driveway leading to a secluded property surrounded by forest. Jacob turned the car around and drove straight back to Mia. "We've got him," he said. "Now we just need to make him talk." Mia looked up from her laptop, her eyes wide. "Then let's bring him into the light," she whispered. And in the silence that followed, Jacob felt something stir in his chest. Not fear, not anger, but resolve. The truth was waiting. They would drag it out of the shadows, no matter what it cost. The sky hung low and heavy, veiled in a gray that blurred the horizon, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jacob stood alone in the alley behind the Shield 1 storage compound, watching the narrow steel door through which Ronald Mathers had entered the night before. His knuckles were white where they gripped the steering wheel. He had slept in the car, if sleep was what it could be called, tense, broken intervals of half-dreams and twitching limbs. But there was clarity in him now, a stillness beneath the exhaustion, as if all the roads behind him had narrowed into one undeniable direction. He waited until the security lights flicked off at dawn, then turned the ignition and pulled away. The others were waiting. Mia opened the door to her apartment with a soft click. dark circles under her eyes betraying her own sleepless night. Oliver sat cross-legged on the couch, a laptop balanced on his knees, his fingers frozen over the keyboard as he looked up. They didn't speak until Jacob sat down and said it out loud. "I found where he sleeps." Mia exhaled shakily. "Are you sure it's him?" "I saw his face. He's older, but it's him, and I know how we'll get to him." Jacob set his phone on the table. On the screen was the image of a local news site, featuring a polished portrait of Mayor Paul Remington beside a headline about a new education grant. This is the man he protects. The man who gave the order, who buried it all. But he's also the man who needs his image to stay clean. He's running for governor next year. If we can shake his security, if we can get Mathers to talk on record, we destroy everything they built. Mia looked unconvinced. "And what makes you think he'll talk?" Jacob reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. It was a letter, his father's last, recovered from the storage unit only days ago. He unfolded it and pushed it toward her. Because he already did. The letter was addressed not to the family, but to Mathers himself. It was brief, almost clinical in tone, but weighted with something deeper. Regret, maybe, or hope. In it, Henry wrote that he remembered Ronald from the early days at the plant, remembered the look in his eyes when he watched the K incident, remembered that Ronald didn't look away. The letter ended with a plea. "You saw what I saw. You know I didn't lie. If anything ever happens to me, remember this. You have the truth. Please don't bury it with me." They read it in silence. Mia's hands trembled slightly as she refolded the page. "That's the pressure point," Jacob said. "He's carried this for 15 years. He may not be a good man, but he's not made of stone. If we confront him with this, we might be able to break him." "And if he doesn't break?" Oliver asked quietly. "Then we go public. Everything. The notebook, the letters, the receipts, the photos. We leak it all and hope the weight of it forces someone to move." Mia leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Then we need to record it. Everything. Hidden camera, audio, proof." "I already borrowed gear from Russ," Jacob said. "He's still got some old equipment. It's not perfect, but it'll do." That evening, Jacob drove back to the secluded property, but this time he didn't go alone. Mia sat beside him in the passenger seat, and Oliver was in the back, watching the perimeter through binoculars. They parked half a mile down the road and approached the house on foot. The woods were damp and thick, every snapped twig beneath their feet making Jacob flinch. The house was small, isolated, surrounded by tall fencing and shrouded by old trees. No lights glowed from within, but Jacob knew Mathers was home. He had watched him return. They waited until midnight. Then Jacob stepped forward and knocked. There was a long pause. Then the porch light flickered on and the door opened a few inches. Ronald Mathers looked much the same as he had 15 years ago, only heavier, his hair grayer, his face deeper lined. His eyes narrowed the moment he saw Jacob. "I know who you are," he said. "You shouldn't be here." "I think I should," Jacob replied. "We need to talk." "I'm not interested. It's about Henry Carter." The door froze in place. Mathers stared at Jacob for several seconds, then opened it fully and stepped back. "5 minutes," he said. "Then you leave." Inside, the house was Spartan. Bare floors, no pictures, no warmth. Just a man living with ghosts. Jacob sat down at the kitchen table and laid the letter on the surface. Mathers didn't sit. "I found this in his locker," Jacob said. "He wrote it to you. Did you know that?" Mathers didn't respond. "I know you saw what happened." I know you were there when that man was killed at the plant. I know my father saw it too, and I know Remington made sure he disappeared. But my father kept records. He kept letters. And he trusted you. Still nothing. You can be the man who keeps hiding, or you can be the one who tells the truth." Mathers sat down. "You don't understand what you're poking at," he said quietly. "You think this is just about one man. It's not. There's money involved. Property deals, contracts, partnerships with people you don't want to meet in a dark alley. Paul Remington isn't the only one who wanted your father gone, but he was the one who gave the nod." Jacob's chest tightened. "Why? What did he see?" Mathers rubbed his face with both hands, then leaned forward. "There was a fight in the plant. A migrant worker, young guy, maybe 20, got into it with Remington over some safety violations. Remington lost control, hit him with a metal hook. One blow, crushed his skull." Jacob stared, sick rising in his throat. "Your father walked in a minute later. He froze. Remington told me to clean it up. Said he'd handle the paperwork. We wiped the footage, got the body out in a meat truck. Claimed the guy never showed up for work." "Why didn't my father go to the police?" Jacob asked. "He wanted to, he was going to, but Remington got to him first. Told him if he talked, his family would pay. That your mother would suffer, that you kids would end up in foster care. Your dad panicked. He came to me, begged for help. I told him to leave, to vanish. It was the only way to keep you safe." Jacob's hands were fists on the table. "And when he tried to come back?" Mathers' face went still. "They found out. Someone saw him in town. I told him not to go to the cops, not without protection. But he didn't listen. He went to Remington's office the next day. That night, he disappeared again. I knew what happened, but I kept my mouth shut. Mia and Oliver, recording everything from a transmitter in the woods, heard every word." Jacob sat in silence for a long time, then stood. "You're going to come with us," he said. "You're going to repeat that on camera, and you're going to name names." Mathers didn't move. "I can't protect you," Jacob added, "but I can promise that hiding won't protect you either. Not anymore. Not when this all comes out." The man sighed, long and slow, and nodded once. 2 days later, Jacob uploaded the video to 3 separate platforms. Mathers' confession, the scanned letters, the photos, the documents, everything. They sent it to newspapers, to online journalists, to advocacy groups. Within hours, it spread. By morning, it had gone viral. By afternoon, city officials announced an emergency inquiry into the mayor's office. By evening, a warrant was issued for Paul Remington. The arrest was quiet, but the media frenzy was not. Photos of the mayor in cuffs, his empire crumbling, his donors fleeing, it all played out in real time. Other names surfaced. Investigations widened. More whistleblowers stepped forward. The plant's cover-ups, the fraudulent contracts, the hush payments, it all unraveled. Jacob stood outside the courthouse the day Remington was arraigned. Linda was beside him in her wheelchair, wrapped in a scarf she hadn't worn in years. Mia held her mother's hand. Oliver stood tall, silent, and resolute. When the mayor was escorted past, he turned his head, and for a moment, his eyes met Jacob's. There was no remorse there, only the hollow stare of a man who never believed he would be caught. A week later, a plaque was unveiled outside the community center. The new one, rebuilt after years of corruption, had siphoned funding away. The plaque bore Henry Carter's name. In honor of a man who stood for truth, even when it cost him everything. Jacob read the words aloud, voice thick. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out one final letter, his father's last, unread. He opened it and began to read. I hope someday you'll understand why I stayed away. I hope you'll know it wasn't because I stopped loving you. I never did. Every day I woke up and thought about you. Every day I wanted to come home. And if you're reading this, maybe it means you found the truth. Maybe it means I didn't disappear in vain. Jacob folded the letter, eyes burning. No, Dad, he whispered. You didn't. And around him stood his family, not broken now, but whole, their silence replaced by something stronger, something earned. They were no longer the family that had been abandoned. They were the family that had endured. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the other videos on the channel and feel free to share this one with someone who might like it too.